In our previous lecture, we had discussed some issues regarding the enzyme science, particularly the sciences that are associated with the study of enzymes, the nomenclature of enzymes, and key issues that relate to the importance of enzymes in the overall perspective of biotechnology. Today, we will be discussing some of the characteristic features of enzymes, particularly as proteins, as their chemical nature. As all of you may be aware that all the enzymes that are known so far are proteins in nature, chemical nature. By proteins, when I say, we immediately understand a chain of amino acids, 20 different amino acids that are linked through peptide bonds, and the size of the chain may extend somewhere from 100 amino acids to 300 amino acids in different enzymes. They are essentially macromolecules of different amino acids. In a sense, they are heteromacromolecules, heteropolymers. That means, the monomer units are not identical in nature, they vary among the 20 different amino acids, and their sequence and the number of amino acids or the relative concentration of each of the amino acid may determine the particular type of enzyme, its characteristic properties as well as its functional aspect. As a macromolecule, we will notice that the properties of the macromolecule will largely depend upon the constituent monomers. In the case of amino acids, they vary in terms of their various properties, particularly ionic nature, their hydrophobic nature, their size. There is large variation, and therefore, the relative proportion of these amino acids also influence the properties of the consequent macromolecule, what we know as proteins. Now, besides a macromolecule of various combination of amino acids, the enzymes may also be considered as a catalyst. When I say catalyst, that means not all proteins will qualify to be called enzymes. Only those proteins which have catalytic function, that means they can accelerate the rate of a particular reaction, we will term them under enzymes. Proteins, as you all may be aware, have very diverse functions in a living cell, like structural, transport molecules, for example, in hemoglobin or myoglobin, defense molecules like antibodies, and of course, the fact remains that their most significant application function in a living cell is catalytic, and enzymes therefore can be termed as active proteins which have catalytic function in a living cell. Alternatively, some of the protein molecules which are known to be enzymes, but may not be intrinsically catalytically active, they require the role of a associated molecule, what we term as cofactor, for their being catalytically active. That means, if the protein molecule itself is not catalytically functional, but in the presence of a cofactor, the molecule may become catalyst and may be considered as enzyme. Now, these cofactors again could range from a small molecular weight organic molecule which may be required to be externally added, like for example, NAD, ATP, FAD, or a variety of cofactors that you are familiar with in many of the biochemical reactions, or they could be as simple as metal ions. And the fact is, now because in the absence of these cofactors, the protein is not catalytically active, it implies that these cofactors have a very significant role in the catalytic mechanism, which these molecules display. Also these proteins may be very simple proteins in terms of a, for example, a simple amino acid polymeric chain. They could also be conjugated proteins. By conjugated proteins we mean, in addition to the amino acids, the protein chain will also be associated with some other non amino acid molecules. Very commonly encountered proteins are glycoproteins. Many of the enzymes, particularly those which are isolated from eukaryotes, are glycoproteins, which means that in addition to amino acids, the protein molecule is associated with an oligosaccharide, monosaccharide or an oligosaccharide. They could be lipoproteins, a lipid molecule, they could be nucleoproteins, and of course, a large number of proteins which are metalloproteins containing a metalloenzyme, where essentially the metal ion acts as a cofactor, are known. Another characteristic feature of these proteins as a constituent or as a chemical body of the enzyme is that in many cases there may be single chain of amino acids, a single chain protein, and many of the industrial enzymes, particularly hydrolytic enzymes, are single chains, and which essentially means that the backbone of the protein is consisting of only one polymeric chain, and in many cases they could be even multimeric proteins. That means more than one chain constitute the whole enzyme molecule. A single chain is not functionally active. The arrangement or the organization of the multiple chains, they could be 2 chains, they could be 3 chains, 4 chains. The organization of those chains provide certain niches which are responsible for the catalytic function. And of course, these multimeric proteins, as some of you may be familiar, have a very distinct role in regulatory aspect of the cellular metabolism. As I was talking about the synthesis of the macromolecule, the basic backbone of the protein chain in the case of a protein essentially lies in the condensation of 2 different amino acids. In fact, here R1 and R2 indicate the distinction between 2 amino acids, and the carboxylic group of one and the amino group of other amino acid, they condense and form a CONH bond, which is known as peptide bond. Now, essentially this peptide bond has a resonance structure. It has a very peculiar properties which are really carried forward in the function and structure of the enzyme molecules. It is a resonance structure. Then also the peptide units are rigid and planar in nature, and the most important property which contributes to its secondary structure is the capability of free rotation about the alpha carbon and nitrogen and alpha carbon and carbon at these 2 sites. They can freely rotate, the bond can freely rotate, and thereby can give rise to hydrogen bonding in the chain between the different amino acid residues in the chain, and constitute the subsequent structural organization of the macromolecule. Now, as I mentioned, the 2 major attributes of an enzyme molecule, that is their chemical nature as protein and their catalytic function. Now, when we look at quantification of an enzyme molecule or an enzyme sample, or what we know as assay methods, they also take into account these 2 major characteristics. The quantification methods could be classified into 2 categories mainly, or they could form the 2 constituents could form the basis of assay methods. One is based on the protein concentration, that means an enzyme sample can be quantified on the basis of a protein sample. That means what is the concentration of protein in a given sample, and in terms of, for example, say milligram per liter, one could determine by any method that are known to us, and I will talk about them a little later. The other way could be, and which is probably more important for assay of an enzyme, is its catalytic function. That means, you assay it or you determine its capability to carry out a biochemical reaction and represent its concentration in the form of initial reaction rate. Now, any catalyst or any chemical reaction, if you look at the reaction profile, it can be indicated as between time and product formed. It will go like this, and ultimately the rate of the reaction at the origin dP over dt at the 0 time will give you the initial reaction rate. Now, this initial reaction rate essentially is considered one of the parameters for determining the concentration of any enzyme sample, and as a convention we give the quantity of enzyme which converts 1 micromole of substrate into product per minute is termed as this rate. The quantity of enzyme which can exhibit this kind of a rate, initial rate, is termed as 1 international unit. So, essentially that is a conventional internationally accepted unit of an enzyme activity. 1 unit of enzyme, international unit of enzyme, is the quantity of that enzyme or the concentration of that enzyme which can convert 1 micromole of substrate into product in unit time per minute. Now, of course, yes.
Is it 1 micromole of products formed per minute, or is it 1 mole of substrate reacted per minute?
Well, when we talk of a unimolecular reaction, mostly
if it is not unimolecular,
in that case we will talk about 1 micromole of product formed. And now I was referring to the definition of one international unit, which refers to the conversion of, or to modify in case of a general statement, 1 micromole of product formed per minute of the reaction can be considered as 1 international unit. Now, one of the limitation, probably, although it may be a very widely accepted unit, but we must also admit that this is not a SI unit, which is an internationally accepted system of units. In the case of enzyme activity, the SI unit is Cattle. So, essentially if you look in the basic units of the international SI system, a Cattle will essentially, in terms of rate terms, will be the quantity of enzyme that will produce 1 mole of product per second, is not it? 1 mole of product per second. So, essentially it is a very large unit. If you compare, if you make a comparison between the international unit and Cattle, it is a very large unit, and 1 Cattle could correspond to 10 to the power 6 into 60 international units, because convert micromoles into moles into micromoles and minutes into seconds. So, basically a unit of Cattle is much larger and one can interconvert. Now, essentially the initial reaction rate is the basic philosophy in determining the enzyme concentration. On the other hand, the protein concentration also gives us an idea of the amount of an enzyme present in a given sample, although it may not always be true. If the protein is not in its functional form, it will lose its status as an enzyme, it may remain as a protein, but the importance of protein concentration lies in the fact that it gives you an idea about the purity of the sample. That means, in case of a mixture of proteins present, you can identify that what proportion of the total protein is the enzyme molecule, or what proportion of the total protein is the catalytically functional enzyme molecule. And therefore, protein concentration determination is another important. So, whenever we analyze any given enzyme sample, we usually resort to both the basis, that means we determine its initial reaction rate as well as protein concentration. A large number of methods essentially are determined are used to determine protein concentration, as you may be familiar, and all of them are essentially linked or based on the native structure of protein. Now, the constituent amino acids of the protein. The most simple system probably you may be familiar is by ultraviolet absorption. That means determining the absorbance at 280 gives you a very precise information about the concentration of protein in the sample, and this absorbance is based on the content of the amino acid residues tyrosine and tryptophan in the protein, which are more or less universally present in most of the enzyme samples. Of course, one of the major limitation of this method is usually that it has it will have the interference or some kind of error involved if the impurities contain molecules that also absorb near this wavelength. And one of the major contaminant in biological samples are nucleic acids, which also have absorbance at about 260 nanometers, and therefore, sometimes you have to make an account of protein concentration taking in view the absorbance as a result of nucleic acids, and very often the lambda 280 minus lambda 260 with some appropriate factors are used to determine the absolute protein concentration in a given sample. Another method which is very popular is Lowry's method, which is based on the production of a blue purple color which absorbs maximum at 660 nanometers with a sodium tungstate molybdenate and phosphate reagent, what we call as Folencio Cal2 reagent, which is usually standard available, and this reagent is very accurate in the sense that you can monitor the protein concentrations as low as 10 milligrams per liter, and a very accurate method which also has many other merits in terms of lack of interference. Another method is Weyrich method, which is based on the reduction with alkaline copper sulphate solution which contains sodium potassium tartrate, and the cupric ions form a coordination complex with the amino groups or the NH group present on the peptide bond. The basic advantage here is that the method is based on the peptide bonds, which is very unique as far as the proteins are concerned. The other polymers or other molecules present as contaminant will not contribute to error in the case of a Weyrich method. Whereas, just to repeat what you asked for the Weyrich method, it is based on the development of a blue color with a alkaline copper sulphate solution containing sodium potassium tartrate. Now, these cupric ions after reduction forms a coordination complex with the NH group present in the peptide bond. So, basically the specificity of this method is based on the reaction with the or coordination complex formation with the peptide bond, which is a unique property or a basic property in all proteins. I mean, unlike in the case of other methods which were based on tyrosine or tryptophan as residues, the relative concentration of these amino acids in the protein will give you different readings, but the Weyrich reagent will give you a very uniform method in case of all proteins. Then you have other methods which are based on dye binding or silver binding method, where the protein can bind certain molecules and the binding is assayed quantitatively and expressed in terms of protein content. But all these methods essentially have a unique linkage, or they have been standardized right from beginning using the more basic fundamental method what we know as Jaldal method. Now, the basis of Jaldal method is primarily estimation of the nitrogen content. Just like peptide bond, the nitrogen content is also an intrinsic component of any protein. Basically, you digest the protein sample with concentrated sulfuric acid in the presence of a catalyst, ammonia is produced, and the ammonia then is absorbed into an acid solution, dilute acid solution, and which is back titrated, and the quantity of ammonia generated can be calculated. and essentially of course there are minor modification in terms of automation and micronization of these methods which are available today commercially, but the basis is to determine the nitrogen content in any given sample and which gives you an estimate of crude protein in the sample. It is assumed that any given protein contains approximately 16% of nitrogen. So, if you multiply nitrogen content by 6.8, you get the net protein again, but it will be called a crude protein in the sense that it will also measure all those molecules which contain nitrogen in addition to proteins. But still it is one of the earliest method that we had known and had been used. So, I think it is a very important aspect is assay, and I think we should be very clear. Another point which I like to highlight here before I proceed further is about the assay is then when we measure initial reaction rate, an important parameter, an important consideration which is important, that is when you measure the effect of enzyme concentration with respect to your initial reaction rate or reaction velocity, the profile is linear at the small concentration range and then it tapers off in the large enzyme concentration range. So, essentially we must ensure that we are measuring our enzyme concentration in the linear range, that means at low enzyme concentration level, and the best way to ensure such a clarity is that instead of taking one sample, we take at least 2 or 3 dilutions of the same sample, which are let us say 2-fold or 4-fold or 6-fold dilution, known dilutions, and the final reaction rate which has been obtained must be proportional to the dilution, and you can ensure unless you get 2 different samples in the same linear range, you cannot depend on the result, because suppose if you take a higher concentration of the enzyme, you may be able to measure this reaction rate, which essentially is much lower than you would have got in a diluted sample. So, essentially one of the conventional ways that we try to ensure that the reaction rate measured is in the low dilution regime, low concentration regime, which can be easily ensured by taking more than 2 samples of known dilution. The next important property of proteins is their ionic behavior. Now, this ionic behavior, you will all agree, results from the monomer units that are present, the amino acids that are present in the system, in the macromolecule. And if you look at a very general feature, that when you consider a long protein chain, bulk of the amino groups and the carboxylic groups in the amino chain will be involved in the formation of peptide bonds. It will be only the residual the amino acids on the 2 ends, one will have a carboxylic group, one other will have a amino group free, and both these groups will be free to ionize at any given pH. As a matter of fact, having both a positive and a negative group at the end will ensure that at any given pH the molecule will have some charge at any given pH. Now, if you look at a very general system where I am assuming that all these R's what are mentioned here, they are non-ionizable. So, we have only 2 groups, a net pocket positive charge. So, at a low pH, the molecule will function act like a cation, and as you increase the pH, it will be negatively charged, and it will behave like a anion, and somewhere in between there will be a 0 net charge. That means essentially it will have both positive and negative charge of equal magnitude, and what we call as deuterion in the case of amino acid. Yes.
Why do we say somewhere in between? Will it not be at pH 7?
No, not necessarily. That will entirely depend on the pK value of the two charges. It will not be at pH 7. It will be at it will depend upon the pK value of the two. That means the negative logarithmic of the dissociation constant of the two charges. And essentially now this situation is a simplified situation, that we are assuming that only two terminal amino acids are ionizing. It will always happen that it will have residues, like for example these R's, which are also ionizable, and the system might system might become a little more complex. For example, consider a protein chain in which you have molecules like take for example an amino acid like aspartic acid. It has two carboxylic group instead of only a amino group. It has an additional carboxylic group. Now at the low pH, again similarly here it will have only one net positive charge, amino group will be ionized. As we move further, increase the pH, it will have one carboxylic and one amino group ionized. Similarly, we will go ultimately when the pH is increased to a level where both the negative ions are ionized and the amino group is not ionized. So ultimately you will also meet here a situation where you have a deuteriene where one amino group and one carboxylic group ionized, the other carboxylic group is non ionized, and that is a status where again this will also depend on the, now this carboxylic group may be different than your the amino group or the carboxylic group known. A similar situation will be in the case of lysine, for example when you have more than one basic amino groups. Now just to give you an idea that some of the ionizable groups found in proteins, it is not only aspartic acid and lysine or glutamic acid that they contribute to the ionization state of a protein. There are other amino acids particularly like histidine or cysteine or tyrosine, they also play a role in ionization and they also have ionization behavior, and their approximately pK values are indicated here. And so essentially the net charge on the protein will depend on the ionization state at a given pH of all the contributing proteins in the system, and that is a very important property which we must keep in mind when we look at enzymes for a variety of functions, whether it is a catalytic function, whether it is a purification of the enzyme protein, the ionic behavior plays a very key role.
When one of the carboxylic groups gets ionized, is there a preference over the carboxylic group which is attached to the main chain rather than which is there in the residue?
That will depend entirely on pH.
No,
And because
among those two, which of the, is there any preference for the one which is attached to the main chain getting preference over the residue?
the preference for what?
For getting ionized, either of it could have become first. I mean, one plus on the NH and one minus on the
So
CO.
that's what I am saying. You see, for example, if you look at let us say the approximate pK values, the N-terminal alpha amino carboxylic group, the C-terminal alpha carboxylic group, the pK is 3, and the let us say aspartic acid beta carboxylic group, the pK is 3.9.
So why is this? That's what I'm asking. Why is this? It's after all a carboxylic group.
No, because it is basically it is linked to another carbon atom, not in the main chain, and the pK is different, and their ionization will totally depend on the pK value of the functional group.
So is it always the case that the pKa for the C-terminal carboxylic group is always lower than the residue carboxylic? Is it always
Well,
the case?
usually yes, but it cannot be cited as a rule. Usually yes. Now then, now this ionic behavior has a very the nature of amino acids has a very important role to play in the conformation of the. Now I think one of the important aspects where I like to highlight is that unlike the synthetic macromolecules which we are familiar in our day to day life, say polythene or styrene, they are all linear chain molecules, long linear chain molecules of hydrocarbon residue monomers. In the case of proteins, the beauty lies that it is a very highly folded molecule. That means its volume is very much conserved. The molecule is very compact, it is not extended like a rod. Of course, not that I must say that there are not no proteins which are not in the extended form. Many of the structural proteins will be in the rod, in the extended form, but most of the proteins which constitute enzymes are globular proteins, and they form almost spherical shape under ideal conditions, but usually they will be in the ellipsoid kind of a situation where you can determine their conformation by their minor and major axis. In fact, there are relationships available where many of the hydrodynamic and transport properties of these polymer solutions can be related to the major and minor axis of the ellipsoid particle, and they are broadly the methods which are used in general to determine the dimensions of the protein molecule or the nature of conformation, or particularly if suppose we know for the native conformation we know some dimensions, and after certain treatment if the dimensions are altered, we tend to understand that has undergone a conformational change. And this conformation essentially is a result of the nature of amino acids, the side chains of the amino acids, the principal functional group, the principal interactions that are present in the case of any given protein or that applies to an enzyme are essentially peptide bonds. As I have already discussed, they form the backbone of the total protein chain, but the conformation essentially is a result of a number of non-covalent interactions. The most important non-covalent interactions which involve in the conformation of the protein molecule are hydrogen bonds. A very large number of hydrogen bonds, individually they may not be very strong in terms of bond energy, but collectively in terms of number of bonds present they provide a very stable structure to a molecule. And essentially as we are familiar, the hydrogen bonds are really the attractive forces between a hydrogen atom attached to an electronegative atom hydrogen atom attached to an electronegative atom and another electronegative atom. That means the electronegative atom oxygen of the carbonyl group and the attached to the hydrogen of NH group, and this kind of a bond particularly between different peptide bonds can create hydrogen bonds, and a large number of these bonds are present in any given molecule. The next important interaction, non-covalent interaction, is electrostatic force. Basically, as I mentioned that the molecule will consist of a number of ionizable amino acid residues, and these ionizable amino acid residues when will interact, they might have the molecules at a distance having positive and negative charges might exhibit the electrostatic interactions and provide a stability to the molecule. Van der Waals forces, the attractive forces resulting from favorable interactions between dipoles, are another very important component in the conformation of a protein. And then of course hydrophobic forces, which are very often considered to be the major force which requires or which is involved in the globular structure of the because of the nature of certain non-polar side chains to drift away from the water molecule, which is in the case of an enzyme solution which is usually water, it causes the non-polar side chains to bury inside the core. That means when you consider a ellipsoid, on the surface there will be most of the charged groups and most of the non-polar side chains will be located inside the three-dimensional molecule. Of course, it does not mean that on the surface there are no hydrophobic patches. Most enzymes will have certain hydrophobic patches on the surface which are required essentially for many functional purposes, because many of the interfacial actions will involve the hydrophobic patches on the surface, and have an important role on the functional aspect. Then I think another covalent bond, disulfide bonds, which have importance in the case of stability of these conformation, are the oxidation of cysteine residue. That means two cysteine residue, they oxidize to give you a SS bond, and that can come at different points in the chain. Therefore, the enzyme can achieve, after the folding is over, the two cysteine residues can join together to form a sulfhydryl bridge, and thereby provide a stability to the conformation. Now, usually the conformation resulting from these forces or these interactions that take place are usually classified into four categories. The simplest and the primary structure what we consider is the sequence and the content of different amino acids present in a enzyme sample. Now, they will vary, both the content as well as the sequence will vary from enzyme to enzyme. There are no similarities, excepting in there will be some homologies of the sequence of different amino acids in same nature of functional enzymes. Then this chain essentially can fold itself locally in the shape of either an alpha helix or a beta or a pleated sheet, so as to give a secondary structure. If you look at the secondary structure, and this is shown a secondary structure in the form of alpha helix, of a right-handed alpha helix. The helix moves upwards, and basically the structure results from the formation of hydrogen bonding between the peptide bonds. That means, you see, if you consider a hydrogen bond is formed between the NH group and of the CO group in the chain at a distance which are located to the residue, from the one residue by 4 amino acid residues. That means, the folding of the polypeptide chain into an alpha helix results with the hydrogen bonding between the NH and CO residues located at this distance of and this interaction results in a kind of a very smooth and regular dimensions of the chain. In the case of alpha helix, that means the distances between these two turns is about 0.54 nanometers per turn, 3.6 amino acid residues going to 0.5, and these dimensions have been standardized over a large number of proteins and are found to be uniform. Then yes.
What is the distance between those two amino acids with the hydrogen bonding? How many amino acids are there?
Four amino acids, and the first and the fourth, okay, the 4 amino acid distance. So now essentially when you look, when the protein molecule gets folded into a secondary structure of alpha helix, the side chains of the amino acids then are projected outwards, almost like a in like a rotatory form, and the side chains, and then they are also free to interact with each other and provide you electrostatic interactions and other features of the. Now this alpha helix, and of course the other type of conformation which many proteins will have, will be again as a result of hydrogen bonding, will be in the form of beta pleated sheet. Now they can be parallel or anti-parallel. The hydrogen bonding between two sections of the polypeptide chain can form beta pleated sheet, and because the polypeptide chain has polarity, as I mentioned in the peptide bond itself has polarity, either a parallel or anti-parallel beta sheet can be formed, and you come across in any given protein sample the alpha helix as well as beta pleated sheet structures very commonly. Now after these secondary structures are formed, again the molecule, as a result of van der Waals forces and electrostatic interactions, folds into a compact globular molecule. Essentially, as I maybe in another version I can show you. if you look at the top figure indicates different shapes indicate different amino acids, and the linear chain of that is termed as primary structure. The folding of this polypeptide chain into a alpha helix, or of course the alternative could be beta pleated sheets, is secondary structure. But then this structure again globular folds itself into a globular form as a result of disulfide bridges, electrostatic interactions, also hydrogen bonding, and van der Waals forces into a globular mass, and the basis of that is essentially to ultimately lead to a minimum energy level, because it will be only at a minimum energy level it will be stable. If any deviation from the minimum energy level will lead to its denaturation and or inactivation of the catalytic function of the enzyme sample. Now, when I use the term denaturation, I must make it very clear here. The term denaturation does not in any way consider the breakdown of the covalent bonds. That is the basic backbone. Peptide bond is not, we are not considering that. Usually disruption of the non-covalent interaction is good enough to lead to denaturation. Of course, in a destructive way you can also break the peptide bond, but then you will be destroying the protein itself. But destruction of or disruption of the non-covalent bonds, non-covalent interactions will retain the protein molecule, but will lose only the catalytic activity, catalytic function, and that is what is the usual meaning of denaturation.
So then breakage of covalent bonding may not result in denaturation.
The breakage of, no, it will. That is the ultimate destructive mode. That means not only you are denaturating it, you are breaking down the protein itself into the constituent peptides. Essentially, it will ultimately cause denaturation. Then the globular form of the folded protein is termed tertiary structure. Now, then many proteins, as I mentioned earlier, they may be oligomeric proteins. That means they may consist of more than one chain, and the arrangement of these chains into a particular fashion so that they are able to bring about certain catalytically active sites is called quaternary structure. Now, quaternary structure is only applicable where the enzyme protein consists of more than one chain. In case of a single chain enzymes, the quaternary structure question doesn't arise, but in the case of a multimeric enzymes or what we call as oligomeric enzymes, the quaternary structure. Now, quaternary structure could be a dimer, it could be a trimer, it could be a tetramer, depending on the number of chains present, and their organization will really lead to the final conformation as a I was talking about the formation of sulfhydryl bond, sulfhydryl bridge. Now, the two cysteine molecules, they can undergo oxidation to give you the cysteine molecule, which is SS bridge, and essentially this bridge is a very strong contributor to the stability of the protein molecule in its tertiary structure. And as a matter of fact, whenever we look into any method, particularly the protein engineering methods, we tend to increase the number of sulfhydryl bridges, because ultimately if you can have more sulfhydryl bridges, it is likely to result into higher stability. Or in other words, most of the enzyme samples which are obtained from thermophiles, that means the organisms that can survive in the extreme temperatures, will contain higher content of sulfhydryl bridges, and that they are probably the features that results into the higher stability. The other issue, a very general issue about the feature of enzymes as protein is the biosynthesis and regulation. Now, as far as the biosynthesis is concerned, the biosynthesis of enzymes in any living system is exactly the same as biosynthesis of any protein. The central dogma of molecular biology covers the biosynthesis of enzymes as a protein. Ultimately, of course, the enzyme in many cases, particularly for oligomeric enzymes, they may undergo certain modifications, there are certain organization changes to lead to an enzymatic protein or enzymatic constituent, but otherwise the synthesis of the protein which leads to an enzyme synthesis is identical. And as you may be already familiar with all the bases, I will not go into detail of that. The basic steps involved are, we all know that the whole sort of information about the synthesis of the protein is coded in the DNA molecule. That means the sequence of nucleotides in a DNA determines the amino acid composition of a protein, and that particular portion of the DNA gets replicated, transcription to mRNA and other forms of RNA, and then translation on ribosomes to protein are the essential steps for protein synthesis. And in case of enzyme synthesis also the same principle applies. As far as the regulation of enzyme synthesis is concerned, most of the enzymes are regulated entities. As a matter of fact, most of the hydrolytic enzymes are regulated by the mechanisms commonly known as induction or repression or catabolic repression. That means the structural gene of the particular protein essentially is bound to a repressor molecule, and unless an inducer is added, it cannot be relieved. And the famous Jacob and Monod's model or the Lac-Operon model was the one earliest studied as far as the regulation of proteins are concerned, and that induction is a very common tool for regulation of the enzyme synthesis. Most of the inducers for many enzymes are essentially the substrate molecule themselves, very often. For example, if you consider a glucosisomerase, which is essentially a xylose isomerase and has a lot of structural similarity with xylose and glucose, the xylose is the inducer. In the case of cellulase, for example, the cellulose acts as an inducer, and for many of the hydrolytic enzymes which are regulated by induction, the substrate itself acts as a inducer. Then they also undergo catabolic repression. That means the availability of a easily assimilable carbon source, and the most easily assimilable is glucose, represses the synthesis of the enzyme, and various other mechanism of end product inhibition and all that will also play a role in the regulation of the enzyme synthesis. Another important feature of regulation here besides biosynthesis is the regulation of the enzyme activity itself. Most of the enzymes are known to have a mechanism by which their even activity can be regulated, not only at the biosynthesis level but at the functional level. That means there are inhibitors and activators molecule which we normally know as effector molecules, which can influence the initial reaction rate of the enzyme in their presence. If you add along with the enzyme sample a known inhibitor molecule, the reaction rate which we obtain will be much lower. Similarly, an activator molecule and increase the reaction rate, and that is a very common feature of the regulation of enzyme activity, and which is of significance even for commercial applications. Another property of the enzymes in terms of proteins is their solubility. All the globular proteins are known to be soluble in aqueous medium, so are the enzymes. The solubility is enhanced by the formation of weak ionic interactions and the hydrogen bonds between solute molecules and water. And obviously, as I mentioned, that the protein molecule has a large number of charged amino acids which can contribute to these ionic interactions with the solute molecule, with the solvent molecule, with the solvent, and also formation of hydrogen bonds with the water molecule. Now, usually the solubility can be influenced by salt concentration, that means the ionic strength, the pH, the organic content in the solvent, that means addition of a polymer, an organic polymer can affect the solubility, and of course temperature is a universal parameter which influences solubility, but you will notice that at least the first three parameters are very commonly used parameters for even isolation of an enzyme sample from a crude protein sample. So finally, to conclude, I would like to say that today we have discussed some of the characteristic features of enzymes that are attributed by its protein nature as a macromolecule in terms of the assay methods, their ionic behavior, their conformation, solubility, and the role these properties play in the various techniques that are used for isolation, purification, or application of these enzymes.
So could you just repeat once more about the quaternary structure?
Quaternary structure, as you asked, has a relevance in the case of oligomeric proteins. That means the proteins that consist of more than one polypeptide chain. More than one polypeptide chain. Now the arrangement of these polypeptide chains into a particular formation, which can result to certain sites or certain interactions which can form catalytic sites. So essentially the arrangement of different polypeptide chains in an oligomeric protein is termed as quaternary. In fact, each chain will have its own tertiary structure, and then this globular structure will assemble in a format. I mean, a very studied example is lactate dehydrogenase, which is a tetramer, consists of 4 polypeptide chains. Now, slight shift in the these units, individual units, can totally change the functional behavior of the enzyme. As a matter of fact, this has led to one of the diagnostic methods, particularly for the patients who are suffering from cardiac problems. The lactate dehydrogenase from the heart muscles undergoes a quaternary structure change, and the change in quaternary structure is related to the disease behavior. That is one of the diagnostic tools. So in fact, all the even conformational aspects are important even for the applications.